The Sculptor's Funeral is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/sculpt. Over 150,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. That's audibletrial.com/sculpt. From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. And today, we will continue our discussion of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the prolific genius of the 17th century, whose sculptural style became the basis for the Baroque style of sculpture. Now, if you haven't listened to the last episode, which is episode 14, I recommend you go and listen to that one first, and that will give you all the background that you need on the life of Bernini and some of his early accomplishments and also the nature of Baroque sculpture, what we mean when we use the word Baroque. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about some of his later works, especially those which revolve around a particular idea or maybe a particular approach to sculpture that Bernini pursued. This idea has come to be known as the idea of the total work of art. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about the time and place in which Bernini was working, a setting that, when combined with Bernini's personality, would naturally give rise to this idea of the total work of art. So the young Bernini, he was a Roman sculptor working for cardinals and popes at a time when the Roman Catholic Church was undergoing a mild identity crisis. You see, in the previous century, the church had to deal with the spiritual secession that resulted in the rise of Protestantism and the separation of several nations from the authority of the Pope in matters both secular and religious, and also the growing consciousness that society did not have to be dominated or controlled by religion at all, and that the pagan humanism of the classical world offered an attractive alternative to the status quo. From 1545 to 1563, a council was convened by the church to come up with kind of a game plan for dealing with these new realities. The result of this council, which was known as the Council of Trent, can be summed up in two words: fight back. The subsequent efforts of the church to win back the hearts and minds, as well as the souls of the world, is known as the CounterReformation. Now, the church, from this point on, consciously thrust itself back into the lives of the people of Europe in every way it could. New spiritual and monastic orders were encouraged and fostered by the church to appeal to a broader, more diverse market of spiritually minded people. Missionary work was stepped up to convert newly colonized areas of the world, as well as sending missionaries to nations which had already converted to Protestantism. Inside the church itself, the level of liturgical and spiritual education given to priests improved in an effort to provide, for lack of a better phrase, a higher quality product for the faithful. In short, the church stepped up its game in the face of the Protestant Reformation. Rather than changing itself to meet the demands of society, the church doubled down on its insistence that it was the sole means of spiritual salvation, as well as the core of civilized society and culture. Appeal to the masses in any way possible was essential to this strategy, and the cultural and artistic endeavors supported by the church had to reflect this. But the church couldn't merely produce good art. It had to produce art that was markedly different from the art popular with the secular and Protestant princes and courts throughout Europe, to reflect the difference in philosophy and theology. So if humanist society praised the ideal nude, the church forbid nudity and sought realism. If the Protestants became iconoclastic, then the church reveled in human depiction. Nobility, grandeur, and the intellectualism inherent in Renaissance and Mannerist art was countered with passion, the passions of Christ's suffering, the ecstasy of salvation, the torments of hell, and above all, the glory of the one holy Roman and Apostolic Church. This was most effectively expressed through exuberance, opulence, and the inspiration of awe within these artworks. Mannerism could enlighten, but the Baroque could astonish. So, in a way, There hardly could have been another outcome than that of Bernini rising to preeminence in Rome in the first half of the 17th century. His early work for Cardinal Borghese was nothing if not astonishing. True, the subjects of his best works at this time were largely pagan, taken from Roman epic poetry and Greek myth, but given the resources and support of the papacy itself, Bernini would surely produce works that would eclipse these youthful masterpieces. So once again, we see how the greatest sculptors always seem to have found themselves in the right time and the right place. And out of all the sculptors in Rome, Bernini was the right person. Bernini was the right person, not solely due to his talent and skill. Bernini had exactly the temperament the church required. His work was exuberant and highly theatrical. And this tendency towards the theatrical was so strong, Bernini made the time in his busy career as a sculptor to give vent to his expressive urges actually in the theater itself. During the reign of Pope Urban VIII, Bernini was required to direct some celebrations for major festivals that would take place in St. Peter's. Bernini was the architect of St. Peter's, so it was his responsibility. He could have jobbed it all out to others, but he personally assumed many of the responsibilities for producing some of the staging and scenery, as well as some sort of mechanical special effects. And from that point onward, he seems to have sort of caught the theater bug in a big, big way. He started writing comedies, and he had them produced, and they were actually very popular. Only one incomplete script survives to today, but he seems to have put on dozens of different plays, directing many himself, which, when you consider his sculptural career, is kind of amazing that he even found the time. One biographer reports that he would sometimes spend a month directing a play by acting out every part individually for the actors to imitate. Most of the plays were comedies of error or social satire, and apparently he was really good at lampooning high society in Rome, good enough that, although the satire was effective, no one seems to have been too offended by it. Now, in addition to writing and directing, Bernini got heavily involved in stage design, especially creating what we would now call special effects. Back then, it was called stage machinery, different devices and tricks for making a sun rise on stage, or maybe tricks of perspective, or giving the illusion of a flood on stage, and all sorts of other illusions. He seemed to absolutely delight in tricking the audience into believing something that was not real. And this extended well past illusionistic stage settings into illusions designed to trick the audience even outside the boundaries of the play itself. I can explain what I mean by that by reading a passage from one of his biographers who was present at such a spectacle. Bernini, quote, made it appear that by a casual, unforeseen accident, the theater caught fire. Bernini represented a carnival carriage, behind which some servants with torches walked. The person whose job it was to perpetrate the trick repeatedly brushed his torch against the stage set, as sometimes happens. It was as if he wanted to spread the flames above the wall partitions. And those who did not know the game cried out loudly for him to stop, so that he would not set fire to the scenery. And scarcely had fear been engendered in the audience by the action and the outcry, when the whole set was seen burning with artificial flames. There was such terror among the spectators that it was necessary to reveal the trick to keep them from fleeing. Unquote. All right, so he's a maniac, obviously. He almost incited a stampede for the sake of an illusion. But I want you to take note that the Bernini's illusion there, it steps outside the action of the play itself, right? The trick of the burning theater isn't really part of the play, but neither was it real life, of course. It's almost like a play within a play. It's somewhere in between, a sort of mini-drama where the panicked audience unwittingly takes a role, the role of a panicked audience. So this blurring of lines between art and reality, what is the show and what isn't the show, what exists outside the show but is still a show, this blurring of those lines illustrates an impulse Bernini exhibited throughout his career in sculpture, and is, in fact, a component of the goal towards which the total work of art strives. Now, this idea of Bernini's, of the total work of art, is an attempt to blur the lines between the traditionally separate and distinct branches of the visual arts, to blur the boundaries which conceptually divide the realm of the work of art from its environment, and, if possible, blur the line separating from the work of art and its viewer by creating layers of realities within the work itself. Now, incorporated into the total work of art would be sculpture, yes, but also color and architecture. Even the lighting which illuminated this total work of art would have to be controlled, providing as full and as rich of a visual experience as was possible. A total work of art requires total control of the art's environment. Now, this idea of a work of art attempting to provide the viewer with a full sensory experience might seem almost banal to our modern sensibilities. I mean, we live in an age of surround sound and high-definition televisions that are like several feet across, three-dimensional films, and every year our technology seems to take us closer to true virtual reality. Now, as our ability to trick ourselves into suspension of disbelief increases, our ability to be amazed at our sensory input actually decreases. I remember when the film Jurassic Park came out in the early 90s, it was an astonishing achievement in representing imaginary, sort of fake forms, in this case, dinosaurs. But it's almost quaint to watch the film now in light of improvements in CGI technology that gave rise to the character of, say, Gollum in Lord of the Rings. Right? The amount of trickery it takes for me to suspend my disbelief has increased over the last decades. And a little over a century ago, in 1895, the Lumiere brothers exhibited an early silent motion picture that lasted less than a minute. It's called Train Arriving at the Station at Ciotat. And the film consists entirely of just that, a steam locomotive pulling into a train station. That's it. But the audience, completely unaccustomed to moving images on a large screen, panicked and fled the room, convinced that they were about to be run over by a train. For that audience, the train was virtually real. It's amazing how far our standards have risen for virtual reality since that time. So when we look at Bernini's attempts at the total work of art, we need to realize that the phenomenon of experiencing virtual reality is relative, and we need to key our expectations down to something close to what might have been the expectations of a 17th century audience. And only then can we fully appreciate the impact Bernini's work might have had at the time. Now, the application of illusion and of separate realities contained within a single work of Bernini's sculpture, it started out slow. It has modest beginnings, and it slightly predates his involvement in the theater itself. It's quite interesting. He was theatrically minded in his sculpture even before he started working in the theater. In his early 20s, at the same time that the young Bernini was carving the mythological groups for Cardinal Borghese, he was commissioned to create a figure of Neptune for a fountain. Now, Bernini's Neptune is a type that's related to other Neptune fountains, such as John Bologna's Neptune in Bologna. But rather than for a public water source, this Neptune was to grace a fountain at a private villa in Rome. Now, Neptune stands with a spread stance, trident at the ready to strike, perhaps at a fish. And between his feet, the figure of a triton blows water through a conch shell. Now, like many of Bernini's early works, it owes much of its compositional ideas to John Bologna, and Bernini has made it a lively adaptation of the Victory Group genre. It's got all the requisite spiraling action, the flame-like silhouette, and it is pleasing and legible from all sides. And all of this is to say that it's a very well-done fountain statue, and it fits well within the traditions of the genre rather than something groundbreaking. There is one aspect of this work, however, that several scholars and observers throughout the centuries have remarked upon, and that may set it apart from others of its type. You see, there's a swirling mass of drapery running off of one shoulder of Neptune and modestly between Neptune's legs. Nothing new there, except that the mass of drapery seems to terminate in a very peculiar fold, which, from several angles, breaks the conical symmetry of the composition enough to sort of draw attention to itself. And when it has the viewer's attention, many notice that the shape of that mass of folded drapery seems to resemble the head of a dolphin. Now, is this a visual joke of Bernini's, Or is it just coincidence? We'll never know. But if it was an intentional visual pun, it would seem to mark the first instance of Bernini alluding to the nature of artifice in sculpture, right? When we, the viewer, discover the dolphin hidden in the drapery, we're kind of delighted, to see how Bernini renders a dolphin out of drapery. But of course, the joke is on us. It's only upon further reflection that we consider that, of course, it's not even drapery, but a chunk of marble. So it's not merely that he's making drapery look like a dolphin. He's making a rock look like drapery, look like a dolphin. Right? So it's that same impulse of theatrical trickery we find Bernini reveling in just a few years later when he begins to direct satires for the stage. Now, right around the time he begins his theatrical work, in the early years of Urban VIII's pontificate, Bernini receives his first architectural commission. It's fairly modest. It's really just a redesign of an existing church and its central altarpiece niche, for which Bernini is to sculpt a Saint Vivian, or Santa Bibiena. Now, for the first time, Bernini is responsible not only for a statue, but for the environment in which the statue is to be placed. And he took full advantage of that fact. In his redesign of the chancel of the church, Bernini inserts a small hidden window above and to one side of his statue of St. Vivian, and it casts a soft glow of light on the statue in what is an otherwise gloomy church. It's almost like a theatrical spotlight, right? And since this light source is obscured and hidden, the statue seems to glow from within. This use of a controlled and hidden light source for sculpture like that is new with Bernini, and it's a device that he will use in several other works later in his career. So, early on in his career, we find the humble beginnings of Bernini's push towards the total work of art, control of the environment of a sculpture, and layered realities within a sculpture. We'll see how he expanded upon both these ideas in a moment when the Sculptor's Funeral continues. Many sculptors and sculpture fans listening will be familiar with the works I'm discussing today, but many will not. If you are not, just go to the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and in the episode gallery of this podcast, you'll find many images that are relevant to today's discussion. While you're at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. You can listen to every episode of The Sculptor's Funeral for free, and you can leave a comment or ask a question. All right, we're back. So, soon after finishing with the Church of St. Vivian, or Santa Bibiena, Bernini is commissioned by Pope Urban VIII to design and construct the Pope's own tomb. Now, it's a project that takes 20 years to complete, and when it's finished, it's hailed as a masterpiece. On this tomb, there are the standard figures and features which accompany the tombs of great men. You've got the effigy figure, the figure of the subject, and then a couple of allegorical figures on either side. Now, the effigy figure of the Pope, his hand raised in benediction, is enthroned upon sort of a large pedestal, in front of which is the actual sarcophagus of the Pope. Leaning on either end of the sarcophagus are the allegories. One figure represents charity, and the other represents justice, and these were to allude to the idea that Pope Urban VIII, during his life, was both charitable and just. These allegorical figures are interesting in that they are not the typical sort of static allegories reminiscent of Greco-Roman allegorical figures, but they actually have an individual personality and character, and they kind of seem to exist in their own narratives, as well as serving the needs of the monument proper. I mean, if you took them off the tomb, they would sort of function as sculptures unto themselves. So far, so good. Nothing too out of the ordinary for a papal tomb. And it being by the hand of Bernini, of course, it's also very well sculpted. But there are a few additional features to this tomb that make this an outstanding work. Now, reclining on top of the sarcophagus is a figure of death, a winged, hooded skeleton made of bronze. Its back is almost to the viewer, and it is rendered in the act of placing a large sort of parchment inscription of the name of the Pope onto the front of the pedestal. This parchment is laid on top of another page which bears the name of Urban VIII's predecessor, Pope Gregory XV. The figure of death itself, placing the final touches on the tomb of the Pope, is a dramatic and effective element. But we need to pause briefly here and really examine what's going on with this, all right? So like the dolphin that's made of drapery in the Neptune fountain, the figure of death seems to exist in a realm separate from the rest of the tomb, right? It's kind of difficult to explain at first, but bear with me. The figure of death is a figure on the tomb, right? It's part of the larger sculpture of the monument to Pope Urban VIII. But it is represented as being in the act of finishing the tomb, right? It's a statue rendered in the process of making itself. So like the dolphin, it serves to emphasize the artifice inherent in works of art, which somehow makes the figure of death exist in a realm closer to our own reality than do the allegorical figures or the effigy of the Pope. Compared to the figure of death, the effigy and allegories seem somewhat two-dimensional and separate from us, and artificial. Or perhaps the figure of death seems to be one step closer to reality than the other figures. However you want to look at it, they exist in two separate realms, if realm is the right word. And the figure of death from one realm is providing context or even commentary on the rest of the sculpture. Now, this idea of a work of art referencing itself in this almost ironic fashion is a hallmark of modernist art. But here's Bernini inaugurating this conception of self-referential art 370 years ago. And on top of this, there's yet another part of the sculpture that seems to exist in its own realm. Scattered randomly over the surface of the tomb are several bronze bees. Now, the family crest of Pope Urban VIII displays 3 bees on the crest. It's a symbol of Urban VIII's family, the Barberini. And to allude to this, Bernini dots the sculpture with bees. Right? They sit on the pedestal and on the sarcophagus as though they have just sort of momentarily landed there. Now, ostensibly, they are not meant to be seen as an integrated element of the tomb's design. And yet, there they are, part of the tomb's design. Their appearance creates a third layer to these constructed realities of the tomb. The effect that these layers of reality have on the viewer is to simultaneously destroy the suspension of disbelief in the work of art, and then build that suspension back up again on a deeper level. It's a sculpture that reveals its own artificiality, but then bestows that artificiality with significance. The more you look at it and interpret its layers, the richer the entire work is. It's similar to the way some of Bernini's works are designed to be fully comprehended through time, right, over a succession of viewpoints. Last week I talked about the Pluto and Persephone, for example, how it unwinds its story gradually as one walks around from Pluto's jovial expression to the expression of terror on the face of the Persephone. In the tomb of Urban VIII, our journey of discovery isn't around the statue, but rather into it. Very soon after the completion of the tomb, we find Bernini exploring these same ideas of layered realities in other works. For example, the memorial to Sister Maria Raji, found in the nave of St. Peter's, could have been a fairly straightforward, wall-mounted memorial plaque. It's a minor memorial. It's nothing like a tomb for a pope. And it commemorates a nun who purportedly worked a few miracles and had visions of Christ and received stigmata. But instead of just a simple wall plaque, we find the colored marble plaque rendered as a large cloth or drapery being blown in the wind. A gilt bronze cross at the top of the drapery, perhaps meant to be the mechanism by which the drapery is pinned to the wall. The cross is sort of knocked crooked by the action of the wind-blown material. And below the cross, 2 putti, in relief, struggle to hold aloft a portrait medallion of Sister Raji. The portrait of the nun itself seems to exist in her own sphere, as she gazes out of the medallion in rapture, right out of the memorial itself, gazing across the nave of St. Peter's and directly at Michelangelo's statue of the risen Christ, as if Michelangelo's statue were also a part of this memorial. So let's examine the layers. First off, there's the realm of the memorial itself in the form of this sort of illusionistic wind-blown cloth made out of marble, and the off-kilter cross, and the putti struggling with the medallion. That's one layer, right? This extremely naturalistic rendering of cloth in colored marble, and the effect of the wind upon it, it's a beautifully convincing illusion. So much so that the viewer is compelled to recognize it as such, right? As an illusion. We appreciate the amount of work and talent it takes to create such an illusion. So this sets up the next layer or realm of the work, which contains the portrait of Sister Maria Raji, right? She is oblivious in that portrait medallion. She is oblivious to the wind which batter the putti and the drapery because she exists elsewhere, right? She's in a realm less artificial and more significant than the illusionistic realism of that first realm. Her gaze outward into the interior of the church effectively blurs the line of exactly where this memorial ends and the realm of the viewer, the audience, begins. And finally, the portrait's eye contact with a statue of Christ across the church draws that work, that statue of Christ, right into the operational realm of the memorial. Every time I see this work in St. Peter's, I instinctively turn towards Michelangelo's Christ as though I expect that statue to respond to her gaze. Now, for my money, Bernini's ability to render layers of reality is as rich and as complex as figurative sculpture can get. It's often overlooked in discussions of Bernini's contributions to the history of sculpture, in the face of his many other achievements and immense technical ability, but for me, it's his ability to psychologically manipulate the viewer into perceiving various states of being in an inanimate sculpture that is his chief claim to the title of genius. This memorial to Sister Maria Raji was made during the pontificate of Pope Innocent X, who really didn't like Bernini. And so Bernini had time to devote to works like this memorial and to several other projects, including several chapels, for which Bernini provided both architecture and sculpture. And it is during this period that Bernini undertakes what many consider to be his masterpiece, the Cornaro Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. The Cornaro Chapel is where we find another masterpiece of sculpture by Bernini, the Ecstasy of St Teresa. It's also in the Cornaro Chapel that Bernini is finally able to fully employ his interest in constructing the total work of art. That is, he creates a single artwork that blends the three arts of painting, sculpture, and architecture into a seamless whole. Let me describe the sculpture first. As I mentioned in the first part of this two-part podcast, St. Teresa of Avila was a Carmelite nun who published an autobiography detailing her mystic visions of visitations by angels and by Christ himself. Her autobiography was a popular one and describes her visions and visitations in almost carnal terms. Now, Bernini's sculpture illustrates one such encounter with an angel who repeatedly pierces St. Teresa with his flaming arrow, causing her to moan in mingled pain and ecstasy. Now, it would have been easy for a lesser talent to lapse into a fairly lascivious representation of such a scene. I mean, it's a very sexually described scene. But Bernini handles the subject with a great deal of sensitivity and decorum, while in no way selling short the very passionate nature of this mystic encounter. The immense drapery that completely hides St. Teresa's body is handled in such a way that she almost appears to be engulfed in flame rather than drapery, and this sort of echoes and illustrates her passion. She reclines on a sort of subtly carved cloud bank, giving the viewer to understand that what we are witnessing is a heavenly vision rather than an earthly scene. And speaking of viewers witnessing the scene, that is exactly what Bernini intended as a theme for the sculpture and for the entire chapel. The Cornaro Chapel is in fact designed more as a theater than as a chapel. The sculpture of St. Teresa is displayed in a niche that more resembles a proscenium stage, complete with a spotlight. Bernini again employs a hidden skylight, like he did with his statue of St. Vivian, but this time the skylight is positioned directly above the statue within this proscenium niche. To reinforce this effect, gilt bronze rays descend and fan out from the hidden light source and produce a sort of celestial backdrop to the scene playing out in the sculpture. The rest of the chapel is a riot of colored marble, which provides contrast to the skylit white statue. But going even further with this theatrical motif, Bernini actually places theater boxes, box seats built right into the side walls of the chapel, complete with sculpted marble spectators who witness and comment upon the spectacle of the Ecstasy of St Teresa. Some are in rapt attention, some turn towards each other. One appears to be reading, presumably Teresa's autobiography. And although these box seats are themselves shallow niches, architecture rendered in perspective as a relief behind the marble spectators creates a convincing illusion of depth. These marble spectators, of the miracle occurring before them, are similar in nature to the winged figure of Death or the bees on the tomb of Urban VIII, right? They're both a part of the sculpture, and at the same time, they set themselves up as elements conceptually distinct from the main subject of the sculpture. But they do much more than just create a layered reality within the sculpture itself. Remember the portrait medallion of Sister Maria Raji and how it gazes out towards Michelangelo's Christ, effectively drawing that sculpture into its own realm? Well, Bernini's marble spectators provide the same type of device, but instead of drawing in another sculpture, the marble spectators draw in the visitors to the chapel themselves. They draw in us. After all, they are statues of us, right? They're statues of witnesses. They witness the Ecstasy of St. Teresa just as we do. Bernini manages to incorporate the audience into the spectacle he created, just as he did when he convinced his theater audience that they were in the midst of a theater fire. In this way, Bernini's conception of the total work of art aims for complete control of the environment in which the art exists, right down to those who experience it. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of The Sculptor's Funeral. But if you think that's all there is to know about Gian Lorenzo Bernini, you are so wrong. I could do a half dozen more podcasts on various aspects of his work. His portraiture, for example, or his clay modeling technique. That alone could fill an entire episode. So if you're interested in learning more about Bernini, and you should be, I have several book recommendations. I would recommend Charles Avery's Bernini, Genius of the Baroque. It's a good place to start. And a few earlier biographies by Howard Hibbard and Rudolf Wittkover. They're pretty good too. Most recently, there's Genevieve Warwick's Bernini, Art as Theater, published just in 2013. And also, there was an exhibition of Bernini's clay and terracotta sketches at the Met in New York, and a book published by the Met in 2012 called Bernini, Sculpting in Clay. It's a great book. It talks about Bernini's training as a clay modeler and contemporary workshop practices and really great images of his surviving models and sketches and much more. Having said that, I will be doing more on Bernini in episodes down the line as well. His influence on succeeding generations was tremendous. And in the very next history episode, we'll actually hear a little bit about how ideas of the Baroque disseminated and evolved, particularly in France. And I hope you'll tune in. So don't forget to check out the discussion happening over at the Facebook group page for the Sculptor's Funeral. And if you want to reach out to me personally, you can find me there at Facebook, or you can email me at thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back soon with more.